want to thank Brittany May and Dan Sanders and the Arizona State Free Thought Society for hosting this event, and also Brother Jed for agreeing to debate, and all of you for coming. Before we get started, I wanted to lay out a few principles and precepts for the debate. This is not a debate over the existence of God. This is not a debate over subjective versus objective morality. My intent is not to cause offense or distress to anyone. This is a very serious topic that we're discussing. I am an enemy of religion. I'm not an enemy of most religious people, so please keep that in mind. This debate is about the Christian Bible and whether or not we would be more or less moral if we lived our lives by it. I also think it's important to clearly define morality before we actually engage in a debate about it. Morality is defined as the principles concerning the right or wrongness of actions. It's the principles concerning the distinction between good and bad behavior. When labeling something as a moral action, we should mean it is something that is exemplifiable and worthy of emulation and praise, something that perhaps benefits society or preserves individual autonomy. When we say that something is immoral, we mean that it's something that's worthy of at least our disapproval and distaste, if not our scorn and censure outright. Perhaps an action that is detrimental to society, or an action that does not preserve individual autonomy. Human morality is complex and evolving along with us, and attempts to elucidate it often leave us more confused than before. But in our relatively enlightened societies today, unless you're a person suffering from some form of mental disorder, nearly every individual is able to agree on nearly all of the immorality of nearly every action. The slow but sure progress of secularism and the mitigatory concessions to moderation have dulled the edge of biblically inspired morality. Today, most Christians disown most of the rules and stories of the Bible that they deem to be immoral. Some even attempt to deny or ignore the entire Old Testament, or somehow rationalize it away, as we just saw. The rationalizations are easily repudiated by the Christian Bible itself, and even by Jesus himself. Moses and Jesus himself say that Brother Jed is wrong. They say he's wrong about the historical or cultural context argument. Jesus and Moses both say that the old laws are completely applicable until the end of days, the apocalypse. I would like to know what evidence Brother Jed is drawing upon, and by what authority he asserts, to make the assertion that Jesus came to teach the spirit of the law, for example, especially when Jesus himself says this is not so. For example, Deuteronomy 4:2, Moses says, "You shall not add to the word which I am commanding you, nor take away from it, that you may keep the commandments of the Lord your God, which I command you." And then Jesus says in Matthew 5:17, "Think not that I am come to destroy the law or the prophets. I am not come to destroy, but to fulfill. For verily I say unto you, till heaven and earth pass, one jot or one tittle shall in no wise pass from the law till all be fulfilled." Jesus again in Luke 16:17, "It is easier for heaven and earth to pass away than for one stroke of a letter of the law to fail." In Mark 7:9, Jesus castigates the Pharisees and the other Jews for not upholding the law of Moses, because they didn't stone someone's unruly child to death. And again, in John chapter 1 and chapter 7, Jesus again affirms the Mosaic laws of the Old Testament. And this isn't even to say that the New Testament is any better than the Old. It is in fact my sincere belief that it is not. Brother Jed, arguing in the affirmative, must convince you that the Christian Bible is a good guide for human morals, and that we would be better off and more moral if we lived our lives by its teachings. And I'm glad that Brother Jed started with slavery, and I'll get there in a minute. It is true that there are some good things in the Bible, but I think that the bad outweighs the good, and vastly so. These good teachings are often cherry-picked by Christians, and the rest gets ignored. Furthermore, the Christian Bible by no means has a monopoly on morally good teachings. Most societies and religions, including many that predate Christianity or even Judaism, contain the same good moral axioms, or better ones. A good example is the tooth for a tooth, eye for an eye that Brother Jed brought up. That's actually the ancient code of Hammurabi, not something that's found in the Bible. Now let's get on to slavery. Probably the easiest moral question humanity has ever faced is that of slavery. Is it moral to own another human being? Is it okay to rob a human being of their free will? The Bible gets this question wrong, terribly, horribly, and unforgivably wrong. We may hear an argument that slavery was more of an indentured servitude, like we just did. So that slaves were generally treated well, or that the biblical laws actually helped slaves. Let's go back to Exodus. While it is true that in Exodus 21 it says, if you buy a Hebrew slave at the end of 6 years, he may go free. It is not an indentured servitude. And you define slavery for yourself in a second. Exodus 21:7 says, when a man sells his daughter as a slave, she will not be freed at the end of 6 years as the men are. If she does not please the man who bought her, he may allow her to be bought back again. I don't know what definition of slavery you're using, but by any reasonable definition, that fits it. And notice that that is governing a Hebrew, but a female Hebrew. In Leviticus 25:44, you may purchase male or female slaves from among the foreigners who live among you. You may also purchase the children of such resident foreigners, including those who have been born in your land. You may treat them as your property, passing them on to your children as permanent inheritance. You may treat your slaves like this, but of the people of Israel, your relatives must never be treated this way. And by no means does the Old Testament have a monopoly on an endorsement of slavery. Jesus, when he came, had every opportunity to tell us that slavery was wrong. If Jesus is supposed to be this shining moral light, shouldn't he have gotten that easiest of moral questions right? In Ephesians 6:5, slaves, be obedient to those who are your masters, according to the flesh, and fear with trembling in the sincerity of your heart, as to Christ. 1 Timothy chapter 6, all of you under the yoke as slaves are to regard your own masters as worthy of all honor, so that the name of God and our doctrine will not be spoken against. This is again noted in Colossians 3:22 and in 1 Peter 2:18. If the Bible can't get this, the easiest moral question right, if Jesus can't get this, the easiest moral question we've ever faced right, why should we trust it to get anything else right? If your holy book tells you how to treat your slaves, your holy book should be disqualified as a source for a moral code, no matter the context. It doesn't matter what the culture or the history were, slavery is wrong, and we know better today. And I'm also glad that he brought up the story of Abraham and Isaac. Abraham is commanded by God to take his son up a mountain, bind him, and sacrifice him on an altar. And at the last second, God sends an angel to stop him. It was just a test, Abraham. It was just a test. You proved your loyalty to God. You proved that you're fearful of God. This man, Abraham, is held up to us as this shining moral example that we should emulate. We should emulate this fear of God. We should emulate this obedience to God. Who among you who have children, and if you don't for a minute, imagine that you do, could ever sacrifice your children? Could ever kill your child? Could ever even threaten or attempt it? But then there's a story that's ignored. Jephthah, Judges chapter 11, 30 through 40. Jephthah promises to sacrifice his daughter as a burnt offering for God, helping him defeat the Ammonites. And he does. No angel comes this time. There's also the story of Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis 19. To summarize, God sends 3 angels to Abraham. Abraham convinces God to spare the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah if a certain number of righteous people can be found within. Somehow he haggles God down from 50 to 10, a good Jew. Two of the angels go to Sodom and meet Lot, who happens to be the only righteous man in Sodom, the only good moral person in Sodom. Lot brings the angels back to his house, and during the night, a mob surrounds Lot's house and demands that he gives up the 2 strangers. Lot instead says, I have 2 daughters, they're virgins. In fact, I'll read it directly from the Bible. Behold now, I have 2 daughters which have not known a man. Let me, I pray you, bring them out unto you, and do ye to them as is good in your eyes. Only to these men do nothing. And this is supposed to be somebody that we're supposed to emulate. This is supposed to be somebody that, according to the Bible, is good, is moral, is righteous. The men refuse and try to break in. The angels strike the mob blind and reveal their identity to Lot. Tell Lot, hey, let's go, get out of the city. Lot does. He brings along his wife and his daughter, although his wife gets turned into a pillar of salt later on. And then God destroys the cities. Let's go back to some of the Mosaic laws as well. Ladies, pay attention. If you're on your period, you are unclean for 7 days. And any who touch you or anything that you touch, for example, the seat you're sitting in now, if you happen to be on your period, we are unclean for a day. On your 8th day, you must bring an animal sacrifice to atone for your unclean discharge. And if you have sex while on your period, both you and the man who you had sex with must be expelled, must be exiled. Leviticus 15 and Leviticus 20. But wait, there's more. Deuteronomy 22:23. If you're raped outside of the town, and the man gets caught, he will be stoned to death. Now we're talking. We're getting something. But if you're in the town and you're raped, both of you will be stoned to death. Because apparently you did not scream loud enough. You didn't cry out loud enough for help. Therefore, you are complicit. That's Deuteronomy 22:23. And arguably it gets worse in Deuteronomy 22:28. And by the way, that last law that I told you only applies if you're married and betrothed. If you aren't, and you're a virgin, and you're raped, the man who raped you must pay your father 50 pieces of silver, and then the two of you get married, and you can never get divorced. You have to marry your attacker. I think that most girls would say that they would rather be stoned to death. And it sounds to me as if these laws were written by somebody who was a Bronze Age sheep herder and didn't know any better, much less about female anatomy. Like all the examples of the people who are supposedly moral, these laws are by no means isolated incidents, and these verses are by no means isolated. They are littered throughout the Old and the New Testament, despite what Brother Jed might say. Though I'd love to give you more in the Old Testament, I feel like the greatest hits that I just went over should probably be enough. Let's move on to the New Testament. Let's first talk about the fact that Jesus himself claims the Old Testament. He says, not a letter, not a stroke of a pen of the law shall ever be changed until he comes back, until his second coming. But let's talk about the actual teachings of Jesus. This proxy punishment and reward, that my crimes can be forgiven by the punishment of another. That in and of itself is immoral. God created this system. If God exists, he created this system. If he didn't, he isn't all-powerful. But according to the Bible, he sent his son to be tortured to death, to appease himself within the very system that he created, and that he knew beforehand that all this would happen. How could anyone send their own son to be tortured to death? Much less when they had the power to make it unnecessary, and much less when they were the reason that it needed to happen. It was their own anger that was the problem. Not until Jesus is the concept of hell introduced, this concept of infinite punishment for finite crimes. The idea of obligatory love. Love me or I will put you in an oven. Imagine you have a child and you tell them that. This is what the Bible tells you is moral. You tell your child, love me or I will shove you in an oven forever. I'm an atheist, and according to the Bible, according to the New Testament, Jesus, I deserve to burn forever for not believing. I can't help what I believe, just like attraction or what I find funny. It's not a choice. I believe what I believe. And if God exists, he made me this way, and he knew beforehand that I would be unable to believe. This God, therefore, consigned me to hell before I was even born. But what if the crime is something like working on the Sabbath? Despite what Brother Jed might say, again, the law has not been changed according to Moses and Jesus himself. You deserve to be burned alive forever? We're told that this is the default, that only through Jesus can we find salvation. What about people who have never heard of Jesus through no fault of their own? According to the New Testament and Jesus, they are all burning eternally in a lake of fire. Thank you.